Member of the full committee, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've always been intrigued by the strategy of dealing with totally dysfunctional schools by helping a handful of people with a voucher get away and leaving the vast majority still stuck behind in the failing school system. Did nothing for the vast majority of students except give them less resources than they had to begin with. Ms. Levin, can the private schools charge more than the voucher amount?
Yes, and they often do. They also have been shown to raise their prices when vouchers come to their state.
And who pays the difference between the voucher amount and the tuition?
That's on the backs of families as well as other non-tuition expenses, making them only accessible to the wealthy.
Now, when these voucher programs start off, is there any explosion in private school seats?
Yes, there's often fly-by-night private schools in strip malls and other places that aren't suitable that rise up to take advantage of the funds.
Now, has that quality been assessed for the new schools?
Yes, they're often low quality and they often close. I believe research shows that about 20% of schools close within a few years. In Florida, it's 30%.
So that when they actually get there, they don't have any better opportunity than they had to begin with.
That's correct, and they also don't have rights.
Well, we'll get to the rights in just a second. Then, do the schools have their own admission standards?
They do, and voucher laws are written to explicitly allow them to keep those standards, even if they're discriminatory.
Now, Mr. Banks indicated that he's an example of that. He said he was denied twice to the school he applied to. What oversight is there on admissions policies?
There's basically none.
Is there any guarantee that those who get a voucher can get into a private school?
There is not, and I've spoken with many families that may have started with high hopes, especially for students with disabilities, and then found that there was no school that would accept their child.
And then what happens to them?
Then they remain in public schools, which now have fewer resources to serve them.
Do schools set their own discipline standards?
They do, and in most places, private schools are not subject to anti-bullying laws like public schools are.
Can they expel students?
They can for things like their sexual orientation, their disability, their academic achievement ability, their English language ability, and many other things that would not be allowed in public schools.
And what happens to those students?
Those students depend on public schools, which again now have fewer resources.
And tell me about the civil rights protections. You said even if discriminatory?
That's right. Civil rights protections are substantially lower for private school students than public school students. I know employment law was mentioned, which is different than the rights for students.
Now, you mentioned Title VI. Disparate impact cases can only be brought by the Department of Education. Are Title VI cases brought against private schools?
Title VI only applies to schools that receive federal financial assistance, and that is an increasingly low number of private schools.
Is acceptance of a voucher federal funding? Isn't that a question about whether or not they're even subject to any of the civil rights laws like Title VI?
Correct. Private school students do not enjoy the protections of many federal civil rights statutes, including Title VI, unless there's federal funding.
You mentioned segregation. I recall as you suggested, the battle cry of segregationists was "Give us states' rights." How do states' rights help enforce civil rights?
Well, states can enact civil rights laws that go beyond federal law. Again, they largely, such as special education laws, wouldn't apply to students who take a voucher.
What oversight is there for private to be able to for us to determine whether or not they're good schools or bad schools? I imagine there's a great deal of variability.
Very little, and again, decreasing with each passing year, and that's a deliberate choice, and we know why. It's because the results are not good.
Are they subject to the NAEP tests?
Most private school voucher programs have very little or no testing requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.